Good morning to you all. It's a great privilege to be here with you this morning. And it's very fitting that, what I'm going to speak about is self-harm and suicide. And I actually look as if I was engaging in self-harm. If you notice, I have a black eye. There was a rumour the last time I was here that I left with a black eye, and I just thought, you know what, I might as well do it this time. And of course, there was no alcohol involved. So what I want to speak to you about is to kind of bring my story to life and to tell you about the situation back home in Ireland. And part of what we really wanted to do in Athena was change the social landscape of how we view suicide and how we view self-harm and mental health in general. Because for a long time in our country, it was very much a taboo. And when you look at the slides here, and we see that over 1 million people die by suicide every year, it's actually quite frightening. And that every 40 seconds, a person dies by suicide. So when you think how many people, for the time we came into this room this morning, how many people would have completed suicide? And actually more people die by suicide than all the armed conflict in the world. And 8 out of every 10 suicides in Ireland are by men. And what's interesting is actually women back home in Ireland attempt suicide more, but men complete it. So just to give you some stats, and we have an organisation at home called the National Suicide Research Foundation, and their figures for 2019 showed that 421 people in Ireland died by suicide. And actually we're a small enough nation. We have a population of about 6 million people. What's interesting is that figure is only the tip of the iceberg, because there are so many suicides that actually go unreported. And one of my cousins, a young gay man who really struggled with his sexuality, completed suicide when he was about 29 years of age. And I remember my aunt saying to me that on his death cert, it's not recorded as a suicide, because just before he took his life, his heart gave out. And what's recorded on his death cert is a heart attack. There are so many drownings that are not recorded as a suicide, and so many traffic accidents in Ireland that are never recorded as a suicide. So, as I said, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Also, because it was such a taboo subject, families sometimes would fight for suicide not to go on the death certificate, also for insurance purposes as well. So when we look at the figures, so it's an increase of 69 deaths by suicide in 2019 compared to 2018. So the figures are still increasing. And definitely an increase in women now taking their life as well. And the rates now for women are between the ages of 45 to 49. And you can see that they're women who's older in life. So in relation to the rates of self-harm, and again, the National Suicide Research Foundation would say that you're 42 times more likely to die by suicide if you have a history of engaging in self-harm. They say it's one of the predictors of suicide. So you can see there that over 12,500 people presented into hospitals, and this was just in the Republic of Ireland alone. And also what we know is that so many people who engage in self-harm never present into the accident and emergency room. It's usually only if they need to be stitched. And that's a whole other story. There's so much research that will tell you that people who arrived into A&E were often stitched without pain relief. Louise Pembroke did a lot of research in that area, because we know that there's a very, very negative attitude from nurses towards people who engage in self-harm. So the peak rates in Ireland are for women, young women between the ages of 15 and 19. And with men it differs, it's between the ages of 20 to 24. And one of the most common methods would be overdosing and cutting. And that's what we would see presented into the hospitals in Ireland. So I want to talk to you a little bit around the language that we use around suicide. And people really lobbied hard in Ireland to have suicide decriminalised, because up until 1993, it was a crime to take your life. Now, I often think that's a little bit ironic, because if you're dead, how could you go to the court anyway? But there was so much stigma, so much of a taboo. People were not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground if you took your life by suicide. So, for that reason, we tend to avoid using the word commit suicide, because when we hear the word commit, it's associated with sin, it's associated with crime. So certainly we would say that somebody completed suicide, somebody took their life, or somebody died by suicide. And, still we have media guidelines as to how suicide should be reported in the media back in Ireland. And you still see this language being used. And I actually genuinely don't think that people do it to be derogatory or to be hurtful. It's just, it was a language we grew up with. So sometimes it's hard to change that language. But I would encourage you today just to be mindful, because people did lobby hard to have it decriminalised. And also, we would never say that somebody successfully took their life, because in our opinion, we don't believe that any suicide is a success. It's a tragedy. So again, in relation to the language, the appropriate and inappropriate language to use where self-harm is concerned, there's different phrases. So people will talk about non-suicidal self-injury, people will talk about self-injury, a very, very old term would have been self-mutilation. And for years in Ireland, if you read a report around self-harm, it would have used the word deliberate self-harm. But there's a psychiatrist in the UK called Nav Kapoor, and Nav really advocated that we drop the prefix deliberate, again because of the negative associations with people who presented into hospital who engaged in self-harm. So we simply use the term self-harm. And you could imagine yourself, if you had a child who engaged in self-harm, how disrespectful it would be to call that person a self-harmer. So for me, I just think it's so disrespectful. If it was my child, I would hate if anybody described them by their behaviour. So just say that somebody is engaging in self-harm. And I think by being mindful of our language, this helps us change the social landscape of how we view suicide, self-harm and mental health in general. And I just think it's so courageous of the people here in Iceland and Lithuania to be able to keep this on the agenda, so as that we recognise that I don't know anybody who's had a charmed life from A to Z, but that we can have a conversation, that we can be real about this, and that ultimately the whole goal of the BUILD project is to encourage help-seeking behaviour. And we do know that the earlier the intervention, the better. So I just want to share a little bit of a personal story with you. When I was 14, my father died by suicide. And I didn't know one other person in the world who'd lost somebody to suicide. And that's 40 years ago now. I'm sure it happened. I saw it on TV, might have read it in books, but I actually didn't know another living human being who shared the same experience as I did. And the words I have up on the screen there were shame, embarrassment, and grief. And I remember my mother saying to us, whatever you do, don't tell anybody how your father died. They'll think we're all a bit peculiar. So this was the message I got at 14 years of age. I couldn't share it with my friends, my best friends. And it's funny how, things stick in your head. I remember I was about 15 at the time, and there was this guy, and oh my God, I just thought he was heaven. I adored him. And of course, he never noticed me. And there was this shampoo called Woodley Green Apples. And if you washed your hair with it, it made your hair smell like apples. And I had really long hair at the time. And I remember begging my mother, get that shampoo for me. So washed the hair, went out that day thinking I was fabulous, throwing the hair, giving him a whiff. And I thought, he's definitely going to see me today. And didn't one of the guys in the group say to me, Cindy? I says, yeah. Didn't your dad stick his head in the oven? And I remember thinking, oh my God. My father had gassed himself. That's how he died. But I didn't know that other people knew. And all of a sudden, I just wanted the ground to open up and swallow me. I was so ashamed. And I remember running all of the way home and the tears streaming down my face. And when I had my first child, I went into the maternity unit. And you know the way they take your medical history. And the nurse said to me, are your parents alive? And I said, my mother is, but my dad died. And she says, how did he die? And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to say? I can't tell her. The shame. I couldn't tell her. And I said, if I tell her now that he had a heart attack, they're probably going to think now that I have all of these heart problems. What am I going to say? And I remember saying to her, he died in a road traffic accident. I was too ashamed to tell my story for fear that I'd be rejected or that people would think I was odd, that we were different. And what we do know is that suicide also runs in families. And I lost 2 cousins to suicide. And I often fear for my own children. But, oh my God, if the Build project was around when I was 14, it would have made such a difference in my life. I would have been able to be open, not to carry shame, to allow myself to be vulnerable in my grief, not to hide it, and not to be embarrassed. So for me, I am just so relieved that the people of Iceland and the people of Lithuania had the courage to take this into the schools, into the young people, give them a voice, and ultimately encourage help-seeking behaviour. And hopefully, in another 40 years, if somebody stands up long after I'm gone, that they won't be talking about shame, that they'll be talking about having the courage to reach out, seek help, and live. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy and Margaret. We really appreciate it that you are spending your time here with us and sharing your experience. We don't take it for granted, and thank you again. Ef ekki klappa betur fyrir þeim. And I'm sure next time you're here, you'll be speaking Icelandic fluently. I have a 7-year-old son. He speaks it fluently. It's really easy.